I want to welcome you to this two-part virtual faith formation series, and I'm entitling it Forgive and Forget. Hang on to that thought. We'll go back to it in a few moments. But we're going to be discussing the process, this grace of forgiveness, and how it is really a very important response and reflection of our life in Christ and our Christian faith. And I'm glad that you've joined us. I want to read just a few words from an older book by Lewis Smedes, who was a theologian in the 70s and 80s, and his words about forgiveness. Dr. Smedes said this: "It is 10 times harder for just an ordinary person whom nobody is watching to forgive and forget. Forgiving is love's toughest work, and it's also love's greatest risk. If you twist something into forgiveness it was never meant to be, it can turn us into a doormat or maybe an insufferable manipulator. In some ways, forgiving seems sort of unnatural because our sense of fairness tells us that people should pay for the wrong that they do. But forgiving is love's power to break that rule." So ask yourself these questions. What do I do when I forgive someone who has done me wrong? Who is forgivable? Are some people just beyond forgiveness? And so now I invite you to come along with me in search of some of these answers to these very important questions of life and faith. Forgiveness and unforgiveness, the flip side of it, is not just a moral or an ethical issue. I believe that it's a spiritual and a religious and a theological issue. And for people of faith, especially those of us who follow the path of Jesus, we believe that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God, and that the constant work of forgiveness because of Jesus is a spiritual issue. There is absolutely no denying what Jesus taught about forgiveness. We cannot live in the liberating grace of God if we choose to harbor and to maintain age-old resentments, hatred, or worse, some maybe secret or unconscious desire for vengeance. As Christians, we love and we forgive because we are loved and we are forgiven by God. We love and we are forgiven in response to the love and the grace and the mercy that already enfolds us. And according to Jesus, the work of forgiveness must be in operation in us, or we have not truly embraced the gracious ways of God that Jesus talked about. If you know much about the Bible, especially the New Testament, you know that the Gospels record several instances of Jesus and his demanding and frankly his countercultural teaching about forgiveness. Because remember, in his culture, limited retaliation or vengeance was permitted. And Jesus came along and taught that that was not acceptable. For example, Matthew chapter 6, the Lord's Prayer that we all know and love and say every Sunday, if not more frequently, "And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." In the 18th chapter of Matthew, Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, asks him, "Lord, how often do I have to forgive? 7 times? Is that enough?" And you know that Jesus responded, "No, I tell you, 7 times 70. Why did he say that? Because it was prescribed in the law that 7 times was sufficient. Jesus said, no, 7 times 70, which is a way of saying you always have to forgive. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was addressing issues about judging other people. And in that little address, he says this: forgive or practice forgiveness, and you will receive forgiveness. I don't think that Jesus was talking about earning God's forgiveness. This wasn't about God, it was about with other people. It was about maintaining healthy human relationships of forbearance and mutual forgiveness. And he says if you practice it, the chances are good that you will be receiving it. In other words, do not practice the age-old scheme of retaliation and vengeance. Let it go. Now I want to go back to something I said a few moments ago. I talked about forgiveness in operation or in process. I use that phrase because I know from my own experience that sometimes forgiveness can take a long time and a lot of emotional work. But I do really believe that the powerful grace of God is present and in operation and at work in us whenever we are at least striving or trying to get there, trying to forgive a wrong that we never deserved. But forgiveness is really hard work. And that is why I resist slinging the word around, this difficult spiritual work around for every sort of superficial slight or annoying behavior. I have 4 goals for this 2-part series. Number 1, I want to reflect with you on some of the more common reasons or things or events that inflict pain and resentment and hatred in us. 2, I want to be clear about what forgiveness is not. Many people have ideas about what forgiveness is, and that's not what it is. I want to suggest what I think forgiveness is, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it acts like. And then 4, I hope that having watched these videos, that you will be free of any unforgiving past hurt or resentment, or perhaps maybe some little lingering secret desire for revenge, because all those things can hold people in sort of a miserable bondage. And maybe, having watched these 2 videos, maybe you can share what you have learned and experienced with a friend or loved one who they themselves are struggling with a deep and a very painful hurt that they never deserved. Maybe you can help minister to them. My experience leads me to say that there is very often one common thread or one common experience that unleashes this deep hurt and pain and resentment in us. And it's just this simple. It is usually some sort of unfair, often completely unnecessary and undeserved treatment. And it hurts most when the inflictor, the one that's giving it out, is someone we know. And I believe that most of us do a lot of simple emotional calculus every day, sort of deciding if we are going to let go or ignore something that was said or done to us that just sort of poked at a raw nerve or didn't make us feel so good, or determining that we're going to let that simmer and maybe start to cause some pain and hurt and emotional suffering in us. We have to sort it out. We have to determine what's really going on. And after 30 years of doing what I do, I can tell you my skin has thickened up. Because we all know that there are plenty of people who habitually just throw off snarky little barbs and criticisms. That there are people who don't care very much, or maybe not at all, about how they hurt, or the hurt that they can cause people who really mean them no harm. So we have to screen some of this stuff out, because if we don't, we're going to spend a lot of time in working in this business of forgiveness. And if we don't do it at all, it will rob us, I can tell you, of joy and peace and freedom. And so much of it is really just sort of petty, and we should just opt out of participating in it. But here's some dynamics that really do bring about real hurt and pain in us. And one is this issue of accountability, that we are responsible for our behavior, that we have volition. That means we can act or not act. We can make choices. We have a sense of what is right and what is moral and good. And the fact that someone chose to do something that caused pain, that is very distressing to us emotionally. Someone chose to do it, and that hurts even more. The flip side of that coin, though, is that we are also morally accountable with the work of forgiveness, whether we need to seek it, we've caused the pain, or whether we need to accept it or grant it to someone else. There's accountability with this stuff. The second dynamic is intentionality. Pain that comes from some completely unintentional event, that's usually much easier to manage than when it seems that someone did it on purpose, that they meant to do it. And what's worse, if they show no remorse or regret for having done it. For example, I think it's probably easier to forgive someone who made you a victim of some unavoidable accident. It just happened. Nobody meant to do it. That's easier than finding out that someone meant to cause the pain. So intentionality plays a real role in how bad we feel and how much it hurts. Another one is this whole concept of disloyalty. When someone we counted on to stand with us and to support us, when they just don't do it, and they choose not to do it. Betrayal, even worse. When someone that we counted as a friend or a loved one or a comrade, when they turn us into an enemy, they move even farther away from, they turn us into their enemy, and that hurts very much. And then finally, the whole issue of brutality. Sometimes we can either emotionally or even physically just reduce another human being to something less than being a fully human child of God who deserves respect and compassion. And that can be emotional or physical brutality. We would treat them as though they're not a child of God. They're less than human. They can and they deserve to be hurt and wounded. Brutality is often the most difficult thing to forgive. So what are the usual outcomes of those sorts of dynamics when they're in play? Well, the word that comes to my mind is hate, which can be a hard word to describe. I looked it up. This is what I found. Intense animosity and dislike. Sort of like when we become brutal in return. We become brutal. We push someone away from us. And sometimes we want bad things to happen to them because of the pain they caused us. That's real hatred. Hatred, I think, is a sign that our soul is unwell. It is sick, and it needs divine healing. And my experience as a pastor is that when we come to hate people, often they are people that we have loved. It's hard, I think, to truly hate someone we don't know. Remember what Jesus said, do not hate those who hate you. Paul the Apostle said, return no one evil for evil given you. Vengeance is the theological word we use to describe this aspect of hatred. It is a desire for the same or a similar degree of pain to come upon the person who inflicted it on us. That's vengeance. I have met a handful of people who live in this condition, some of whom have sat in the pews of our churches, and they are without a doubt the most unhappy, miserable, and bound up souls I have ever known. Now, I want to end this with describing some nice things that really are not forgiveness. Things or activities that people think are forgiveness and they're not. First of all, this whole concept of forgetting. If you remember something, well, you certainly haven't forgiven. Forgetting. As if the deep wound was not torn open, as if nothing happened. I've met people who try to do that. What often happens is it unconsciously leads to more self-destructive behavior. I think we need to remember and acknowledge the pain that we never deserved. So do not make forgetting a litmus test for forgiveness. Some wrongs are so heinous that they must never be forgotten. Acknowledged, but not forgotten. Not forgotten so that they are not repeated by the offender or by other people. And this is often the case with extreme brutality, especially brutality that manifests in inappropriate and unwanted sexual advances. Do not forget. Excusing. Do not think that excusing moral accountability is the same thing as forgiveness. I've heard people say things like, well, the devil made me do it. Well, you know, there's evil in the world and evil gets a hold of people. Well, they had bad genetics or bad parenting, or it's just culture. As if people are not ultimately responsible for their actions. That's why excusing is not forgiveness. Sometimes people choose to do what they do. They choose to cause harm and pain, and excusing the behavior as if it was no big deal, as if they couldn't help themselves, in my opinion, that denies the image of God in the perpetrator. We are responsible. We have moral accountability. Here's another thing that is not forgiveness. Trying to smother conflict and confrontation and disguising that as forgiveness. Sometimes conflict has to be confronted so that peace and respect, true respect, can flourish or for the atmosphere to change. So just simply trying to tamp down any kind of conflict or not addressing it is not the same thing as forgiveness. That's something altogether different. And tolerance. A lot of people mistake tolerance for forgiveness. Yes, sometimes we have to decide what we're going to put up with. And some things really are small and insignificant. But repeated, hurtful, wounding behavior, it becomes intolerable. And therefore it must be confronted. But that's not the same thing as true forgiveness. Forgiveness is another thing altogether. I hope you'll come back next week, and then we'll discuss what we think forgiveness really is, what it can look like, and what it can feel like on the inside. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday.